As people continue to roll in, everyone has about another 4 or 5 minutes. You're opening up the document that says capitalism or communism, and then you're going to check off the box that best fits the statement. All right, that is what you're starting with. It's a little bit of a do now, a little bit of a different way to start a class for us. So you guys get started with that. Yes. If you just came in, you're just filling this document up, putting an X in the box that if it's a capitalist statement, X in the box if it's a communist or socialist statement. If you weren't here yesterday, you won't know how to do this. If you were here, this should be pretty straightforward. There might be 1 or 2 that might trip you up, but I think it should be pretty straightforward. Two minutes, or as my Spanish-speaking friends say, 2 minutos. Yes, we will. We will go over the answers shortly. Okay, 30 seconds, get as much done as you can, and then we'll go over this quick. All right, guys, let's get started. So first one is going to be capitalism. That is our economic system that we should know. And the next one's going to be communism/socialism. All right. Number 3, everyone makes the same amount of money. That is more of a communist/socialist statement. There are rich and poor people depending on how much people make. Okay, that is a capitalist statement. All right, now the rest I'm going to leave on to you guys. Number 5, people are responsible to make money and a living for themselves. Capitalist or communist? Capitalist or communist? Capitalist. That's capitalism. Good. Number 6, people are responsible, are working for the community and or the government. All the money is combined together. Communism. People are provided free education, healthcare, jobs, and food, but they don't choose what type of education, healthcare, jobs, and foods they get. Communism. Money and goods are divided equally amongst its people based on needs. That is a typo there. Okay, good. People pay to buy whatever food, clothes, and housing they want. Capitalism. Good. People choose what job to have or what college they want to attend, but will get paid differently. Capitalism. Good. 11. Gates, Bezos, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and other billionaires prefer to live in this economy. Yes, in a communist society, all their money is going to get taken away. Students in the Bronx, New York, all get provided a free lunch and free education when they attend a public school. Interesting. Yeah, a little more communist/socialist, right? If it's free, it's going to be government run. It's more communist socialist, and that's okay. There can be some socialist programs in a capitalist economy. It's not a bad thing. You just don't want maybe too much. Vincent gets paid $200, blah, blah, blah. Capitalism, good. 14, everyone at the textile factory works together to create products. At the end of the day, factory gets paid an equal amount. You guys are flying. Communism, good. A businessman decides what his company sells and how much the products cost. That's really all you have to read. Okay, that is capitalist. Okay, so you have a good understanding now. All right, moment of truth time. You knew this was coming. So now you get to vote as a class. If you would like me to grade your Unit 5 test as a capitalist, or would you like me to grade it as a communist, just as a reminder. If I grade it as a capitalist, whatever your individual grade is what will be put on Jupiter. If I grade it as a communist/socialist, I will take the average from all of the 8th grade classes, and everyone will get the same grade average, okay? Anyone have any questions, not comments like vote this way? Anyone have any questions before I post the link? All right, going once, going twice. Okay, vote. You have 2 minutes to vote. And you're to see it live. You'll see what you guys all vote on once it all comes in.
Oh, can we vote more than one?
No, you cannot. Limited to 1 response. Oh no, we're gonna find out in 60 seconds what the class wants. You guys see all the responses coming in. I have 51 people here, should have 51 responses.
So are you gonna like add up all the results from this form from the whole 8th grade, or is this just for our class specifically?
This is for your class specifically. So this is complicated. So for the class specifically, I'm doing class by class, but I'm taking the grade average. So I give like you guys all an opportunity to vote for your class. Because I have some classes that are only 6 people, you know, and I'd like to give different classes different opportunities. What is the grade average? You have 30 seconds to vote, otherwise your vote will be voided. Does not count. We have to move on with the lesson. Some people playing video games. That's the problem right now. All right, 10 more seconds. If it's just 39 responses, just 39 responses. I'll post the link one more time if you want to do it really quick. 41. All right, really just 15 more seconds now, and then that's it. We got a good majority. Hey, I will say though, the form isn't working for me. All right, well, Heaven, if it's a close vote, then we'll see. We'll ask what you wanted, but we'll see if it's close. If your vote truly counts, people have the right to not vote. That is true with American society, of course. So if people did not want to vote or are not here to vote, that is up to them. In the last election, we had, something like 140 million people vote, but there's 240 million eligible voters. So still only 65% of the country voted. All right. Okay. I think we've got enough time. So let's just see. A moment of truth. Let's go here. Summary, down, down, down. There you go. 90% voted capitalist. 9.8% voted communist. Therefore, we will get rated in a capitalist way. The final vote tallies were 37-4. Let's go to here. All right, so I got to update this a little bit. All right, so you guys can see my screen, right? I've done this every year. You guys are pretty much what most of the groups ended up voting. You don't need to write this down. I think this is just a good little lesson. Getting this in real time. Anicia, correct. For a class full of kids living in the Bronx, a lot vote for capitalism. Correct. 37 capitalists. Let's see the official tally. 37-4, I think it was. 37-4, yep. So let's explore Anicia's comment a little bit. So the idea generally is that, let's call a spade a spade. The Bronx is not an overly wealthy community. It's not, horribly poor. Okay, the school you go to is not, we're not in a horribly poor area, but it's not, a wealthy school. I think we could agree that PS 89 is not a wealthy district comparatively to some of the other cases. So when I first did this, I always thought that the voting would be a lot more similar. No, you don't have to copy the red down. This is just kind of just something to learn about and to understand. And I think the idea, a lot of people like the idea of being fair, maybe poor people, making some more money and you take away from some of the rich. So you have this kind of, gap that shortens. And the idea was that, when I started teaching in the Bronx is that there would be a lot of students who are coming from, quote unquote, poorer communities compared to where I grew up in Westchester, New York. I would assume that there would be more votes for communists/socialists, but that's never the case, as you can tell. I mean, it is always overwhelmingly capitalist or communist. Last year I did it. It was the closest it ever was where I polled the whole school. It was 79% to 21% capitalist to communist. That was last year, and I polled the school again this year, and it's very similar to what you guys have. Most of the kids end up voting capitalist because I think everyone likes the opportunity to be in control of their own grades, so to speak. Now, we're looking at it from a money perspective at times, but everyone's looking at it from their own grade perspective. And people that are, even students that don't get, hundreds and 90s and don't get, high 80s are realizing hey, it may not be something I want to do where I'm relying on other people for a grade average. There's kids that don't take the test and get zeros. There's kids that don't do as well. And oftentimes kids don't want to put their average up against that. So socialism requires all of the groups of people basically doing a good job and working together. The reality of the situation is, as you know, think of a school. There are some students that work really hard and study very hard and get very good grades. There are students that study very hard but maybe don't get as good grades. And then there are students that like don't do anything. All right, they don't get as good grades. So in those society, you have that, right? You have people that work their butts off, okay, do a lot, you know, make a lot of money. And then there's people that don't do as much and, you know, don't make as much money. So the whole idea is why, like, you know, kind of comparing it to grades is, well, I want to say, Maheen, I think collectively, if everyone in socialism and communism worked their butts off, and everyone as a whole, everyone in the population did, then I think it's an excellent system, to be honest. But we know society. We know that there are some people that work their butts off and some people that don't. That's just how it is. And you take school. Some kids work their butts off in school and some kids don't. The students that don't work their butts off in school may be good at other things, right? And they may work their butts off in other things. So it's not necessarily the end of the world if someone doesn't work their butt off in school. But when I say, like, hey, your grade is going to be reliant on everyone in the school, okay, changes a little bit. Well, Anicia, I think the rich work their butts off, the poor have to. I think sometimes that is true, and then sometimes it's not. It's like everything else. I mean, I would be hard-pressed to believe if, you know, a brain surgeon, we looked at the example yesterday, didn't work their butts off. A brain surgeon's rich. You know, I would be hard-pressed to believe if a brain surgeon doesn't work their butts off. Now, are there situations where you have a spoiled kid whose family made a ton of money and the kid doesn't work hard? Absolutely, those are those situations. I mean, of course. And there are situations where a poor person works like 4 jobs or 3 jobs and has to raise a family and can barely make ends meet. That happens too. So both are true. So the real negative with capitalism is, yeah, you can have these situations where rich people are handed everything on a silver platter and the poor people kind of don't get much. But I think when you bring it down to grades, you know, do you want to work on the grade average? And some people don't. You know, let's say, because Maheen was bringing up, let's say Maheen gets a 97 on the unit 4, you know, 5 test, but then the class average is a 75. So in Jupiter, she gets a 75. That next test, what is Maheen going to do? Is Maheen going to work as hard? Maybe not. She's like, well, if I'm just going to get 75, why do I even study? Why do I even bother? So what Maheen does next, and this is kind of the problem, is Maheen then doesn't work as hard. So Maheen was getting a 97. Okay. Now Maheen's like, you know what? Who cares? I don't care. She gets a 78. Well, now she was getting the highest grades. So what happens to the grade average on the next test when she gets a 78? The grade average goes even further down. And this is one of the huge problems in history with communism/socialism that you'll learn about. Not saying it's a bad system, but I'm saying this is what ended up happening, like in the Soviet Union. Eventually, since you have no more rich people, the overall amount of people that the government made was not a lot. Because people ultimately stopped working hard for their individual making money or grades. So what I wrote here is capitalism can sometimes lead to income inequality. There's very rich and very poor. Socialist or communist tendencies are all about lowering the income of the rich. You have to get the money from somewhere, right? Just like the grades. I have to get the grade average from somewhere. So it ends up being I take the higher grades from the students that did really well and I kind of give it to the students that didn't do as well. So we go there. The same thing goes with income, right? If you have a lot of rich people, they're making the most money, they're creating the most jobs, and if you take the money away from them, hypothetically, give it to the government or give it to the poor to have the wealth gap kind of go down, that's kind of the issue that we're talking about here. And I always find it interesting, as Anicia said, in the Bronx, I thought, you know, some students are poor and come from really tough situations. Some students are doing fine and their families are fine, but, you know, we have some tough situations in school. We got to be, you know, the reality is. I am always amazed how many people end up choosing capitalist. I think people want that individual, you know, choice that they could do as well as possible. What Milagros said and what Abigail said and what Maheen is kind of saying is, I think, the big issue. That I think if a socialist or communist country can figure that out or get everyone to buy into everyone working hard together as a group. Now, there's teams, right? You play on a sports team, and the sports team, everyone's working hard. It's a great thing. But in society, it just never seems to work out like that, because there's always like, well, you know, I'm not going to get, if I put in all of the work, I'm not going to get all of the rewards, sort of thing. So like, people stop trying. And you'll see that happens in communist Soviet Union as the years go on. Capitalism tendencies don't necessarily want to help out the poor by giving money from the rich to the poor. They try and help out in other ways by trying to create jobs, you know, sometimes trying to create programs that help out the poor, but they don't really want to take away from the rich to give to the poor. That is meant for Friday. Your test is Friday. I apologize. This up here was, I just never updated. Sorry about that. This is from the other classes I was doing this with earlier on. They had a quiz on Wednesday. All right. So are there any questions before we move on to the rest of the assignments and stuff? I think that's an important thing. As I told you, I am biased towards being favored towards capitalism. I really try to teach that as unbiasedly as possible. I really, really did. If it didn't come off that way, I do apologize. But I know how history has panned out for some communist and socialist countries, and it hasn't ended up well. So I think the idea of it is a beautiful thing, but like, when you really deep down think about it, it's just like no one actually really wants to do that. And your votes are kind of that. Like, no one wanted to, like, oh, I don't really want to do the grade average. I don't want to, you know, have my grade compared with someone who's not even showing up, hypothetically. And that's what's happening, right? That's what will be happening. All right, final questions. Okay, cool. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that little exercise. This is still continuing the notes from yesterday, so it's the same focus question. We're going to look at how capitalism and communism really became a problem. This whole issue became a problem. So let's start here with the Palmer raids. You have about 3 short slides today. This is the first one. So you guys can copy down what the Palmer raids are. I'll give you a minute to do it. It's definitely something you will see on your test on Friday. Good question, Rosemary. Yes, I will post the slides for you. That I will gladly give. Those you will get tomorrow, I believe. I have it posted for tomorrow. You'll get the Roaring 20 slides and the World War I slides in case you missed any notes. Okay, so let's go over the Palmer raid. So first off, it was led by the Attorney General. Now, the Attorney General in our country is like the White House lawyer. He's like the biggest lawyer in the country, hypothetically. And he had an assistant who was known as J. Edgar Hoover. Yes, Sanjita, there'll be a quiz too. It's all posted tomorrow. Does anyone know who J. Edgar Hoover was or ever heard of him before when he ended up running? He's pretty famous, but like I don't know how famous compared to you guys. Yes. First off, Herbert Hoover was a president, but that's not him. J. Edgar Hoover was the leader of the FBI. Okay, so he becomes very big in terms of communism a little bit later on in this class. But for now, we're going to look at Mitchell Palmer. He's the leader of the Palmer raids. And if you kind of go around the picture, you'll see what it's kind of doing. It's designed to target and arrest anyone who is supportive of two things. Communism, okay, which we are well aware of. So if there was a supporter of communism in the country, they were basically looked at as a threat or like a spy, and they were arrested. Okay, so you guys know what a raid is. A raid is when someone enters a place and arrests a bunch of people. And also an anarchist. Now, an anarchist is kind of the complete opposite of a communist. A communist is wanting like the government to be fully in control. An anarchist is kind of the complete opposite. An anarchist wants no government control. We'll talk about anarchists later when we get closer to World War II. But basically, it was anyone who was on the extreme political spectrum. Someone who wanted a communist government or someone who wanted no government at all, they were targeted by the Palmer raids. okay? And the groups that the Palmer raids were most focused in on, we kind of talked about this yesterday, were the workers. Why were they most worried about the workers in a country, the everyday people that work the normal jobs? Why were they most worried about them? Aura Muhammad, yep. Muhammad's correct. They were paid less. So if you put that together, a lot of the workers weren't paid as much as the bosses. Since they're not paid as much as the bosses, they would be fearful that they would maybe go on strike because they were unhappy at their job. The communist takeover in the Soviet Union was because a lot of the workers, the working class, they're called the proletariat, they were poor. And they overthrew the government. So the government, the United States government, was worried about that. So anyone who was thought to be practicing communism or thought to be an anarchist was raided and arrested. Now this goes into some amendment rights a little bit. The Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, the Fifth Amendment. Now people have a right to believe, kind of what they want, but they were able to word it along the fact that communist takeover would be like treason. So they were able to kind of arrest people on legal grounds at this time, but it was controversial. All right, let's do some Regents questions to make sure we're on the same page. During the 1920s, the Palmer raids, the immigration quotas, which we learned about earlier on in Unit 4, and the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, which we'll learn about shortly, resulted from what? Good, guys. 3. You just need to know radical means extreme, and you should be fine. Okay, and an idea that was not conducive to what the American government and economy was about, and that would obviously be communism, anarchists, immigrants coming in from other countries who may bring in some more radical ideas. Which pair of events illustrates an accurate cause and effect relationship? Meaning, because this happened, this was the result. Okay, good. This is also 3. The Red Scare worried people, red is another word for communism, worried people about communism. Therefore, we should remember from yesterday, this limited immigration with the Quota Act, which is a review, and the National Origins Act. Okay, moving on here. Okay, yes, you do have the opportunity to go get to the Supreme Court packet now. Could someone tell me when you open up that the graphic organizer, the last Supreme Court case that you guys worked on, was it the sugar case? I can't remember because I went on parental leave, so I just not sure. U.S. versus EC9. Okay, yeah, not one of the biggest cases. This one's underratedly big. It's called Schenck versus the United States. It takes place in 1919, but like becomes a huge thing throughout the 1920s. I would say it's one of the underrated Supreme Court cases you could see on a Regents exam. It's not Marbury versus Madison. It's not Plessy versus Ferguson, but like this is one we definitely need to know. All right, so let's settle the situation. Charles Schenck, he was a socialist, which we know is similar to communist. He was under Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs was one of the best known socialists in the country. He actually ran for president as a socialist. Didn't win throughout the 1920s, but he was a pretty popular socialist in the United States. All right. And yes, you have to copy down what's in red, which Milagros helped out with. Thank you so much. So basically, he tried to get people in the country back during World War I not to submit to the draft because it was against the 13th Amendment, which is an interesting take. A military draft is basically forcing people to go into a war And Schenck kind of argued and tried to convince people that that was like slavery, forcing people to go do something they didn't want to do, which could be argued, but, you know, definitely a little bit controversial. And this led to a lot of people speaking out against the government during World War I. And the government decided to take radical action. They actually arrested Charles Schenck, and it became one of those cases that got to the Supreme Court because he's using his First Amendment rights. You know, he's kind of just stating his opinion that the 13th Amendment is, you know, should stop people from being drafted. All right, so this becomes a Supreme Court case, and it's centered around the First Amendment. And basically the final ruling was that freedom of speech from the First Amendment could be restricted if the words spoken or printed represented to society a clear and present danger. So the most classic example, you know, you'll ever hear is if we're in the auditorium and I start screaming, "Oh my God, guys, there's a fire. We need to get out of here. Everyone rush the door, get out of here." If I try and cause a panic like that, and then someone gets hurt, I'm actually liable. Now, if there was an actual fire, I'm not liable. But if I was lying, okay, if I'm saying something that's untrue, you can get in trouble for that. You think back prior to this, you know, obviously Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. We talked about that. There were plans to assassinate the president. There was really nothing written about, you know, what happens if there's a threat to kill someone? What if there's a plan to assassinate the president? Schenck versus the United States basically limits some of the things you can say and limits the amount of free speech that you will have. Okay, it doesn't, you know, end it. You could still say, you know, Joe Biden's a good president. You could say he's a bad president. You could say Mr. Panio's a good teacher. He's a bad teacher. You're not going to get thrown in jail for that. You still are willing to, you know, okay to say those things. But if you go like, you know what, that Mr. Panio, I don't like how he's teaching. I'm going to kill him. All right, well, now you can get in trouble. All right, it's a threat. Okay, and that is basically covered under Schenck versus the United States, and basically says that Charles Schenck was trying to get people to have a riot, basically. And he was found to be guilty of the crime. And then also this is the precedent that we got going forward. Okay. I think we should have enough time here. There might be some more Regents questions, I'm not sure. And then there's one more slide. Yep, okay. So these are, this is the big thing you'll see in the questions, the term clear and present danger. All right, in Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court decided that a clear and present danger to the country allowed the federal government to restrict the First Amendment rights. In stating the principle of a clear and present danger in Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court established that what? This is an interesting one. There's that civil rights and constitutional rights are not absolute. Yeah, so we've talked about this already, and this is one of those examples, right? You do not have absolute rights. Right now, sitting here, Mr. Panio does not have his Fifth Amendment rights. I was not accused of a crime, okay? When I get thrown in jail for, you know, committing a crime, I no longer have my Second Amendment rights. I no longer have my Fourth Amendment rights. Right? You don't have them at all times. Habeas corpus, right? When there's a war that breaks out, you can be arrested for no reason. Okay, if the government deems you a threat. Okay, if there's a rebellion or if there's a war. So just please, that's a very big thing on the Regents. You don't always have your civil rights. And this is the last one. All right, very short one. This is a great example combining both immigrants and people just fearful of communism coming together. So Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, they are two Italian immigrants who were openly anarchists. This is the last one you put in your notes, regular notes. All right. They were Italian immigrants. They came from Italy, just like my ancestors did right around the same time, you know, right around the early 1900s. And what would make them different from my ancestors for sure is They were open anarchists, meaning they did not like government control at all. In Italy at the time, when they came over, the government was like horrible. Okay, in early 1900s, Italian government was horrible. So these two people particularly didn't trust the government, so therefore they were anarchists and wanted to overthrow the government, I guess you could say. But they never did really anything. But there was this very famous trial. It's not a Supreme Court case. It's just a trial that captivated the country. You know, like if you recently, you have the George Floyd trial, right? The George Floyd trial is not a Supreme Court case. It's just a very big trial. O.J. Simpson's another great example, right? If you ever know about the O.J. Simpson case in the 90s, I don't know how well you guys are familiar with that. That's another thing that wasn't a Supreme Court case. It's just a big trial. So Sacco and Vanzetti was a trial that captivated the country because it came in the middle of the 1920s where communism was a big fear. Immigrants weren't as well liked. But when you really look at the story, you will see that it's like kind of messed up. All right, we'll see what happens. So they were accused of murdering a couple of people during an armed robbery. His famous "I didn't do it" gloves, yes. That is the O.J. Simpson case, pretty much, in a very oversimplified way. All right, so we're going to take a look at the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. We're going to do the reading together, and then there's like literally 3 or 4 questions, and you guys will be done for the day. Now, I'm going to have another one of those bias alerts. This reading is biased in favor of liking Sacco and Vanzetti. The history of these two really tends to believe that they were innocent of every crime that they were kind of given. But this is obviously going to be biased in favor of them. So let's read the article, understanding that it is a little bit biased, but for the Regents, we also have to look at it from the perspective that the Regents is also biased towards them as well. All right, so let's look at it. You'll see why it's biased toward them. Yes, you can tell from the title right away. It's like you guys are familiar with this, with the bias in media and yellow journalism. Like this stuff hasn't changed in 150 years. All right, and this is another one of those examples. So, Sacco and Vanzetti, a modern perspective, 2 immigrants targeted for their beliefs. 80 years ago, Sacco and Vanzetti were put to death by the state of Massachusetts. They had been wrongly convicted and sentenced to death for the robbery and killing of 2 men, a paymaster and a guard who were delivering wages to a shoe company. And that was a tragedy. 2 innocent people died, and Sacco and Vanzetti were blamed. During the 7 years of imprisonment, people around the world organized a campaign to save these 2 men, both Italian immigrants and anarchists. But despite overwhelming support and the abundance of evidence pointing to their innocence, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in 1927. To understand why this travesty of justice occurred, we first have to look at the hostile political climate towards immigrants and radicals at the time. Following the First World War and what became known as the Red Scare, the U.S. government responded to a wave of strikes and political unrest with force. The Palmer raids, which we just learned about 15 minutes ago, of the early 1920s, organized by Mitchell Palmer, resulted in thousands of radicals, especially immigrants, being rounded up, beaten, and held for days without the right to contact a lawyer or even family. It's clear from the court proceedings that Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted not because of the evidence that proved them guilty, but because they were anarchists and immigrants. There's a famous, saying, if you ever get into law, that just because someone's a bad person and you don't like them doesn't mean you can convict them of a crime. That's bad police work. Okay, if they're innocent of the crime, but like a horrible person, you have to charge them with something else. You can't just charge them because they're a bad person or you think they're a bad person. That's not how things work. Sacco, for example, was badgered by prosecutors as to why he dodged the draft rather than fight in the First World War. Judge Webster Thayer, who presided over the trial, said to the jury at the outset, although this man Sacco may not have been committed the crime attributed to him, he is nonetheless culpable or guilty because he is the enemy of our existing institutions. If there was, let's say, a white supremacist this year that is a horrible person, right, and is, put on trial for a crime of, killing a black person, let's say. If he is innocent of that crime, but is still like a racist white supremacist, you can't convict him of the crime. The way this judge admits to this is horrible. It's not how things work in our country. Just because a person's a bad person, you can't, put them in jail for not doing a crime. Just because, they're not good. Outside the courtroom, a friend of the Judge Thayer's reported that he heard him say, "Did you see what I did with those anarchist bastards the other day?" The jury was made up of white, native-born people, and the jury foreman was a former police chief who saluted the American flag every time he entered the room. The saluting the American flag isn't a big deal, but the fact he was biased towards the police probably isn't a good thing, okay, in a case where, the police are basically wrongly accusing someone of someone doing something. This was the jury that, in the midst of an incredible anti-immigrant backlash, was supposed to impartially decide the fate of 2 Italian immigrants who were avowed anarchists. As an appendix to a collection of Sacco and Vanzetti's letters states, outside the courtroom, the Red Scare hysteria was rampant. It was allowed to dominate within. The prosecutors systematically played on the feelings of the jury by exploiting the unpatriotic and despised beliefs of Sacco and Vanzetti, and the judge allowed him thus to divert and pervert the jury's mind. The anti-red sensationalism overshadowed the evidence put forward that Sacco and Vanzetti were not the culprits. A total of 99 witnesses took the stand to say that they were innocent. Just before the robbery took place, Sacco was at the Italian consulate office trying to obtain a passport, something that a consulate official testified to, so he wasn't at the crime scene, basically. More than a dozen people took the stand to verify that Vanzetti had delivered fish to their homes, miles away from the crime scene on the day of the killing. So again, just not in the area, so it couldn't be him either. Prosecutors failed to find the stolen money or come up with credible motive for why the 2 anarchists would steal workers' wages. I mean, anarchists don't want the government, so why would they steal money? During the years that they were behind bars, an impressive campaign was launched to win them a new trial. On the eve of their August execution, miners in Colorado went on strike. There were clashes with police in London, Paris, Geneva, Switzerland. So this, basically, not going to name all the places, captivated a lot of the world. But Judge Thayer denied 8 different requests for retrial put before him. In a letter to a friend from death row, Sacco wrote, "What I wish more than all this in this hour of agony is that our case and our fate may be understood and serve as a tremendous lesson to the forces of freedom, so that our suffering and death will not have been in vain." Okay, we should know what in vain means, okay, back from the Gettysburg Address, but they know that they're going to die because they're on death row, and they're like, we need to be better as a justice system, I guess you could say. Vanzetti's statement also is a testament to the impact the 2 men had. If it had not been for these things, I might have lived out my life talking at street corners to scorning men. I might have died unmarked, unknown, a failure. Now we are not a failure. This is our career and our triumph. Never in our full life could we hope to do work for tolerance, for justice, for man's understanding of man as now we do by accident. Our words, our lies, our pains, nothing. The taking of our lives lives a good shoemaker and a poor fish peddler at all. That last moment belongs to us. The agony is our triumph. So obviously this is a pretty biased article. You'd love to hear the police perspective. You'd love to hear the judge's perspective, but that's not what the assignment is. And that's not what the way the Regents handles this. So we're not going to do this. The culture of the 1920s has a big role in the trial. Culture throughout society in national trials are very big. All right, keep an eye on the George Floyd trial as it starts to come out a little bit. We have a very worried society in the way Black people are treated by police. So in the trial, it's going to be a huge part of that culture. The culture is going to be a huge part of that trial. Okay, whatever the culture is of the time does, in fact, mess things up a little bit, or in some cases, get the trial correct. Okay. There are 5 questions here. You just need to do the first 3. Do question 1, question 2, question 3. Okay, you'll notice here that's all you have to do. Just 3 questions, very straightforward. All right. Tomorrow when you guys come here, we will do about 15 minutes of notes. You're doing your last topic, which is known as the Scopes trial, something different from this trial. And then we are going to wrap up the Roaring 20s and start watching the review video on the Roaring 20s and getting ready for our test, which is Friday. Any final questions before we get out of here? No, senor. Okay. You guys can get out of here a little bit early. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I will see you all tomorrow.